Hi friends, today I will tell you about the paranormal events that occurred in an orphanage in Spain in the 1980s, and the terrifying experiences of the poor children there. The story began on a rainy and foggy autumn night in a very old orphanage. In the cold night, there was the sound of a child crying deeply. Javier, the caretaker responsible for cleaning and maintenance at the orphanage, went to the front door and found a baby crying in a small basket there. He looked around, but no one was visible through the mist. Then he picked up the basket and started to move towards the inside of the orphanage, accompanied by the cries of the child. But suddenly he shuddered. Whispering voices had come from behind, and he turned around. But again, no one was there. Thinking it was just the sound of leaves rustling, he entered the orphanage and closed the door. Once inside, the child's crying had stopped. Then the caretaker handed the child over to the foster mothers in the orphanage and went to bed. He couldn't sleep all night, as if there were whispers around him. He would get up to check, but couldn't see anyone, yet he felt uneasy. That night, he understood that there was something strange about the abandoned child. From that day on, he kept an eye on the child and began to observe him. After that night, nothing would be the same in the orphanage. On the following nights, other children began to wake up screaming and terrified from their sleep. All the children, after waking up in terror, would scream that they had seen a terrifying creature with no red eyes coming to take them away. Some of the children had started sleepwalking and descending into the basement and cellars of the old building. Now the nights were filled with chaos and fear. The children didn't even want to sleep, fearing that the terrifying creature with red eyes would come again. That night, the caretaker women in the orphanage had managed to put the children to bed to make them sleep. Javier was lying in his bed. There was a great silence in the orphanage. He was actually a bit surprised because in a place where there was always an event every night, tonight there was silence. Javier became suspicious of this silence and got up from his bed to patrol the corridors and dormitories. When he entered the dormitory, he was shocked. None of the children were in their beds. Where had the children gone? He immediately ran and knocked on the door of the head nun in charge of the caretaker women. Head nun Elvira, upon hearing what had happened, ran back to the dormitory with everyone, but the children were gone. They began to search the entire building first. As they started to look into the basement floors, whispers began to be heard again. The caretakers looked around in fear, and when they entered the last room in the basement, they found all the children there. The children, as if hypnotized, were whispering in a strange, incomprehensible language in unison, gathered in a circle, whispering in a very ancient arcane language, and in the middle, the baby left at the door. The caretakers had difficulty waking the children up and had taken them back to their bedrooms. The children who lay back in their beds didn't understand what had happened and didn't know how they had ended up in the cellar. The caretakers put them back to sleep and kept watch over them. The next day, the priest of the church, Father Francisco, had come to the orphanage to see what had happened. Father Francisco began to interview the children one by one and asked them what they had seen. As if they had all agreed upon it, they all said the same thing, that the same creature with red eyes had taken them and led them down to the cellar, pointing at a wall. After talking to Javier, Father Francisco learned that all these strange events had started after the baby was left at the door. When Father Francisco went to the dormitory to examine the baby, he was quite surprised to see a strange mark on the baby's body, and without saying anything, he hastily left. Seeing Father Francisco's quick departure, Javier and Sister Elvira couldn't make sense of it and just looked at each other in confusion. Father Francisco had gone to investigate who the baby left at the door belonged to. He was curious about the story behind it and was researching how the mark on the baby's body had occurred. The mark belonged to an ancient demon, and he had seen this mark years ago when he was still a child. This was his second encounter with it. They intensified their investigations with the police, and they learned that the child had come to the town with a strange woman who had disappeared after leaving the child, and no one had seen her again. When Father Francisco returned home from the police station, he was very surprised to see the woman standing at his door. The woman they had been looking for was standing right in front of him. After a few seconds of not knowing what to say, he approached the woman gently. "Hello," he said. The woman, scared and shy, replied, "Hello, Father." Then they went to the church. "Do you remember me, Francisco?" the woman asked. When she addressed him by name, Father Francisco paused for a moment and looked at her carefully. "Oh my God, it's you." "Olivia," Father recognized the woman. Olivia and Father Francisco had grown up in the same orphanage, and years ago, Olivia had left the town and hadn't been seen since. Olivia began to tell what had happened to her. She had been trapped in the orphanage for years, subjected to torture and abuse. The former caretaker, Pablo, had tortured many girls for years, and some children couldn't bear the torture and died. She had managed to escape with those children and had deceived the caretakers by saying that they had run away from the orphanage. The screams of those children still echo in my ears, she said. Father Francisco asked, "And where were you? What happened to you?" Pablo forcibly abducted me from the orphanage and imprisoned me in an old shack. He continued to torture me for years, and I became pregnant many times and had children. He tortured both me and my children, forcing us to worship Satan and dedicate our souls to him. All my children died from neglect and disease, and I was left all alone. I escaped with my last baby to prevent him from dying of illness, and that's why I brought him here, she recounted. Father Francisco now remembered. The mark on the baby's arm was the same as the one he had seen on Pablo's arm in his own childhood. This mark belonged to the ancient demon, Amun. Amun's teeth resemble those of dogs. He can appear both human-like and with a wolf's head. He has a serpent's tail and is considered a demon of hatred. That madman had also marked the baby's body with the same symbol. He had sold and devoted his soul to Satan. Father Francisco and Olivia went to the police together and told them everything. The police went to the shack where the woman had been held captive, but they found no trace of Pablo. Later, Father and Olivia went to the orphanage to see the baby. Many things had settled in the father's mind by now. He gathered all the children again and repeatedly asked them what they had seen in their dreams, how they had descended into the cellars, and why they had taken the baby with them. He tried to understand why the terrifying creature with red eyes they had seen had pointed to the wall, and finally he went to that room to investigate. The father begins to examine the wall. He notices an anomaly in the wall. Realizing that a portion of it was later bricked up, he discerns that there was actually a door that had been sealed shut. Later, the police are called, and they are asked to conduct an investigation. The police demolish the wall that was added later and uncover the hidden room. In the room, excavation reveals torture instruments, the bones of children who had gone missing over the years, tools used for worshiping Satan, and various books. Whether the entities that frightened the children in their dreams were good or evil remains unknown. However, the revelation of a truth concerning the unfortunate children who were tortured to death, without even a grave to mark their passing, has been brought to light. From that day on, the old orphanage building was sealed, and the children were relocated to a new building within the city. This old orphanage is now referred to by the townspeople as the House of the Devil. And finally, the body of Pablo, who had disappeared and couldn't be found, was discovered years later in the cellar of the House of the Devil with a rope around his neck.